In the Middle Ages, women had no rights. They couldn't fight wars, couldn't engage in politics, couldn't be free. So how did some women manage to rule kingdoms, win battles, and manipulate male rulers like puppets? The manipulation techniques used by medieval Europe's most powerful women were so effective and complex that their victims never realized the truth. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. These women lived in a world where a single misstep could mean death, exile, or worse. They had no armies of their own, no legal authority, no official power. Yet they shaped the course of European history through pure psychological manipulation, turning the very system that oppressed them into their greatest weapon. They understood something that most people never learn. True power doesn't come from force. It comes from making others believe they want to do what you need them to do. The techniques they developed were so sophisticated that they would impress modern psychologists. They mastered the art of reading human nature, exploiting male ego, and creating intricate webs of influence that spanned entire continents. Most remarkably, they did it all while maintaining the illusion that they were merely obedient wives, devoted mothers, and pious Christians. The men they controlled never suspected that they were being manipulated by the very women they thought they dominated. This is the story of medieval Europe's ultimate puppet masters, women, who wielded invisible power with deadly precision. Eleanor of Aquitaine was perhaps the most successful manipulator in medieval European history, a woman who controlled two kings, launched crusades, orchestrated rebellions, and shaped the destinies of England and France for centuries. Her methods were so subtle and effective that even today, historians struggle to separate her genuine emotions from her calculated strategies. Born around 1122 as the heir to the wealthy Duchy of Aquitaine, Eleanor possessed something more valuable than any crown: vast lands, enormous wealth, and most importantly, the intelligence to use both strategically. When her father died, she became one of the most eligible women in Europe, but also one of the most vulnerable. In medieval society, an unmarried woman with extensive holdings was like a lamb surrounded by wolves, and Eleanor knew she needed protection to survive. Her first marriage, to Louis VII of France, appeared to be a typical political alliance arranged for mutual benefit. But Eleanor had no intention of being a passive wife who merely produced heirs and stayed silent during important discussions. From the beginning, she began implementing a sophisticated strategy of psychological manipulation that would define her entire life. Eleanor's approach to controlling Louis was masterful in its subtlety. She never directly challenged his authority or openly contradicted his decisions. Instead, she positioned herself as his most trusted advisor, the one person who truly understood his burdens and supported his ambitions. She would listen to his concerns with apparent sympathy, ask thoughtful questions that led him toward the conclusions she wanted him to reach, and praise his wisdom when he made the decisions she had carefully guided him toward. The key to her influence was making Louis feel more masculine and powerful in her presence, not less. She understood that men of that era needed to believe they were strong, decisive leaders, so she crafted her manipulations to reinforce rather than threaten their self-image. When she wanted Louis to take military action, she didn't argue for war. She expressed feminine fears about threats to the kingdom and confidence that her strong husband would know how to protect them. When she opposed a policy, she didn't debate its merits. She worried aloud about how it might affect his reputation or legacy. Eleanor's most ambitious manipulation involved convincing Louis to join the Second Crusade. She had her own reasons for wanting to travel to the Holy Land, including personal interests in the region and a desire to enhance her own prestige. But she couldn't simply demand that France launch an expensive and dangerous military campaign for her benefit. Instead, she worked on Louis's religious convictions and his desire to prove himself as a worthy Christian king. She arranged for Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the most influential religious figures of the age, to preach the crusade at court. But before his arrival, she spent months preparing Louis psychologically, expressing her own deep religious feelings, questioning whether they were doing enough to serve God, and wondering aloud whether other kings were more devout than her husband. By the time Bernard delivered his sermon, Louis was primed to see crusading not just as a religious duty, but as a way to prove his spiritual superiority over rival rulers. The crusade itself was a military disaster, but it served Eleanor's purposes perfectly. The journey allowed her to establish relationships with important figures throughout the Byzantine Empire and the Crusader states, connections she would later use to advance her political goals. More importantly, the stresses of the campaign created the perfect opportunity for her to begin distancing herself from Louis while making it appear that he was the one losing interest in their marriage. Eleanor's strategy for escaping her marriage to Louis was perhaps her most brilliant manipulation. She couldn't simply ask for a divorce. Women had no right to initiate the dissolution of marriages, and abandoning a king would have meant giving up her lands and possibly her life. Instead, she needed Louis to want to divorce her while believing it was his own idea. She began by subtly undermining his confidence in their relationship. During the crusade, she paid more attention to other men, particularly her uncle Raymond of Antioch, creating jealousy without actually committing adultery. She became more critical of Louis's military decisions, not openly but through sighs, worried expressions, and private comments that suggested disappointment in his leadership. She started questioning whether their marriage had been blessed by God, pointing to their lack of male heirs as possible divine disapproval. Most cleverly, she began researching their family genealogies to find grounds for annulment. Medieval marriage law forbade unions between close relatives, and Eleanor discovered that she and Louis were related within the prohibited degrees of kinship. But rather than presenting this information directly, she arranged for religious advisors to discover the relationship independently and bring their concerns to the king. The annulment of Eleanor's marriage to Louis in 1152 appeared to be a mutual decision based on religious scruples, but it was actually the culmination of years of psychological manipulation. Eleanor had successfully engineered her own freedom while maintaining her reputation and retaining control of her vast territories. Louis, meanwhile, believed he was acting as a responsible Christian king by ending a marriage that God had never blessed. Eleanor's next target was Henry Plantagenet, the future Henry II of England. This time, her strategy was completely different because her goals had changed. Rather than seeking escape, she wanted to create a partnership that would make her the real power behind one of Europe's greatest thrones. Henry was younger than Eleanor, ambitious, and intelligent enough to recognize her value as an ally rather than merely a wife. Her courtship of Henry was a masterclass in making a powerful man believe that marrying her was his own brilliant idea. She positioned herself as the prize that would complete his conquest of Western Europe, the sophisticated older woman who could teach him the subtleties of international politics. She made him compete for her attention while never appearing desperate or overly eager. Most importantly, she demonstrated that she could be a genuine partner in his political ambitions rather than a burden or a mere symbol of legitimacy. The marriage between Eleanor and Henry created one of the most formidable political partnerships in medieval history. But Eleanor's greatest manipulations were yet to come. As Henry's power grew and their relationship became more complex, she would face her ultimate challenge, controlling not just one king but an entire dynasty of them, including their own sons whom she would turn against their father when necessary. While Eleanor of Aquitaine mastered the art of marital manipulation, Matilda of Tuscany developed an entirely different approach to controlling powerful men, one that combined religious authority, military strategy, and psychological warfare to bring the Holy Roman Emperor himself to his knees in one of the most dramatic political spectacles of the medieval period. Matilda inherited the Duchy of Tuscany in 1056, making her one of the wealthiest and most strategically important rulers in Italy. But unlike Eleanor, who operated primarily through personal relationships, Matilda positioned herself as the crucial link between earthly and divine power, using religious authority as her primary weapon against male opponents, who vastly outranked her in terms of traditional political power. The key to understanding Matilda's manipulation techniques lies in recognizing how she exploited the fundamental contradiction at the heart of medieval political theory. Kings and emperors claimed their authority came from God, but the Church taught that spiritual power was superior to temporal power. Matilda positioned herself as the guardian of this spiritual authority, making it impossible for even the most powerful secular rulers to challenge her without appearing to challenge God himself. Her greatest opportunity came during the investiture controversy, a conflict between Pope Gregory VII and Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV over who had the right to appoint bishops and other church officials. This dispute might have remained a theological debate, but Matilda transformed it into a personal confrontation that would define the relationship between church and state for centuries to come. Matilda's manipulation of this crisis was extraordinarily sophisticated. Rather than openly taking sides, she positioned herself as the mediator between the two most powerful men in Europe, while secretly working to ensure that the conflict would be resolved on terms favorable to her own interests. She understood that both Gregory and Henry needed her support to achieve their goals, giving her leverage over both men that she used with ruthless precision. Her first target was Pope Gregory VII, a man whose reformist zeal had made him powerful enemies throughout Europe. Matilda recognized that Gregory's strength, his uncompromising moral authority, was also his weakness. He was so committed to his principles that he often failed to consider the political consequences of his actions. Matilda presented herself as his most loyal supporter, the one ruler who truly understood his spiritual mission and was willing to sacrifice everything to defend it. But Matilda's support came with strings attached. Though she was careful never to make her demands explicit, she hosted Gregory at her castles, provided him with military protection, and funded his political activities. In return, she gradually became indispensable to his decision-making process. When Gregory faced difficult choices, Matilda was there to offer counsel that always seemed motivated by pure religious devotion, but consistently advanced her own strategic interests. Her manipulation of Gregory reached its peak during the crisis that led to Henry IV's famous submission at Canossa. When Gregory excommunicated the emperor and released his subjects from their oaths of loyalty, it created a political emergency that threatened to destroy the Holy Roman Empire. Henry was forced to seek forgiveness, but Gregory was initially reluctant to grant it, knowing that reconciliation would weaken his position in future conflicts. Matilda orchestrated the entire Canossa episode with theatrical brilliance. She convinced Gregory to make his reconciliation with Henry as public and humiliating as possible, ostensibly to demonstrate the Church's power over secular rulers. But she also ensured that the confrontation would take place at her castle, under her control, with her as the crucial intermediary between the two men. The image of Henry IV standing barefoot in the snow for 3 days, waiting for papal forgiveness while Matilda controlled access to the Pope, became one of the most powerful symbols of medieval political theater. But what appeared to be Gregory's triumph was actually Matilda's masterpiece of manipulation. She had positioned herself as the indispensable broker between the two most powerful men in Europe, while ensuring that both would be weakened by their confrontation. Matilda's treatment of Henry IV during the Canossa crisis revealed her understanding of male psychology and the power of calculated humiliation. She didn't simply make Henry wait, she orchestrated his waiting to maximize its psychological impact. Each day of delay was carefully planned to increase his desperation while demonstrating her own power. She controlled what he ate, where he slept, who he could speak with, and even when he was allowed to relieve himself. More subtly, she used the crisis to establish a personal relationship with Henry that would serve her interests long after the immediate political crisis was resolved. While publicly supporting Gregory's harsh treatment of the emperor, she privately showed Henry small kindnesses that made her seem like his only ally in a hostile situation. She brought him food, provided warm clothing, and offered sympathetic words about the difficulties of leadership. This dual approach, public humiliation combined with private compassion, was a sophisticated psychological technique that created a complex emotional bond between Matilda and Henry. He couldn't help but feel grateful to her for her kindnesses, even while recognizing that she was one of the architects of his humiliation. This emotional confusion made him more susceptible to her influence in future interactions. After Henry's submission at Canossa, Matilda's relationship with both men became even more complex. Gregory had achieved his immediate goal of demonstrating papal supremacy, but he had also created a precedent that would limit his own freedom of action in future conflicts. Henry had avoided immediate political disaster, but his authority had been severely damaged, making him dependent on allies like Matilda whom he couldn't entirely trust. Matilda exploited this situation with remarkable skill, playing Gregory and Henry against each other while positioning herself as the indispensable mediator between them. When conflicts arose, both men turned to her for support, and she carefully doled out her assistance to maintain the balance of power that served her interests. She never allowed either man to become too powerful or too weak, understanding that her own influence depended on their mutual dependence on her mediation. Her military strategy complemented her political manipulations perfectly. Matilda maintained one of the most effective armies in Italy, but she used military force as a psychological weapon rather than simply as a means of conquest. Her soldiers were highly disciplined and well-equipped, but their primary function was to make potential opponents think twice about challenging her rather than to actually fight battles. When Henry IV finally recovered enough political strength to challenge the Pope again, Matilda was ready with a new strategy. She had spent years building a network of alliances throughout Italy, but she had also maintained her personal relationship with Henry, ensuring that he would be reluctant to attack her directly, even as he moved against Gregory. This allowed her to provide crucial support to the papal cause while avoiding the full consequences of Henry's revenge. Matilda's greatest achievement was transforming herself from a regional Italian noble into one of the most important political figures in Europe, all while maintaining the fiction that she was merely a devout Christian woman serving God and the Church. She had manipulated two of the most powerful men of her age so successfully that they both continued to seek her support even after recognizing that she had been playing them against each other. While Eleanor and Matilda operated on the grand stage of international politics, countless other medieval women perfected the art of manipulation within the confines of royal courts, wielding invisible power that often proved more effective than any army or treasury. These queens and noble women developed techniques of psychological control that were passed down through generations, creating a hidden tradition of female political mastery that shaped European history from behind the scenes. Isabella of France, known to history as the She-Wolf of France, provides perhaps the most dramatic example of how a seemingly powerless queen could orchestrate the downfall of a king through pure psychological manipulation combined with strategic alliance building. Her campaign against her husband, Edward II of England, was a masterclass in turning a king's own weaknesses against him while maintaining the appearance of feminine virtue and injured innocence. Isabella's situation when she became Queen of England in 1308 was precarious in ways that would have destroyed a less intelligent woman. Edward II was already deeply involved with his favorite Piers Gaveston, a relationship that scandalized the English nobility and marginalized Isabella from the beginning of her marriage. Rather than openly protesting or demanding her rights as queen, Isabella adopted a strategy of patient observation and careful relationship building that would eventually give her the power to destroy her husband completely. Her first step was to study Edward's psychological weaknesses and the political dynamics that surrounded him. She recognized that Edward's relationship with Gaveston was not just a personal preference, but a political liability that alienated powerful nobles who felt excluded from royal favor. Rather than attacking this relationship directly, Isabella positioned herself as the reasonable, long-suffering wife who was more concerned about the kingdom's welfare than her own personal happiness. Isabella's manipulation of court politics was extraordinarily subtle. She never openly criticized Gaveston or later favorites like Hugh Despenser, but she cultivated relationships with nobles who were frustrated by their influence. She hosted private dinners where she listened sympathetically to complaints about royal policy, offered gentle observations about the difficulties of governance, and gradually built a network of allies who saw her as a potential alternative to Edward's chaotic leadership. The key to Isabella's strategy was her understanding that medieval men, no matter how frustrated they became with a king, needed moral justification for rebellion. Simply wanting power or revenge wasn't enough. They needed to believe they were acting to protect the kingdom, the church, or some higher principle. Isabella provided this justification by transforming her personal grievances into a national crisis that required heroic intervention. Her manipulation of her son, the future Edward III, was particularly brilliant and ruthless. She understood that a rebellion led by a foreign-born queen would always be suspect, but a campaign to protect the rightful heir from a corrupt father could attract widespread support. She carefully shaped young Edward's understanding of his father's failures while making him believe that he was developing his own independent judgment about political affairs. Isabella's decision to travel to France on a diplomatic mission in 1325 provided the perfect opportunity to implement her long-term strategy. She had convinced Edward to send her as his representative to negotiate with her brother, King Charles IV of France, about territorial disputes in Gascony. But once she reached France, she refused to return to England, claiming that she feared for her life because of the influence of Hugh Despenser. This refusal was a calculated act of rebellion, but Isabella presented it as the desperate action of a victimized woman seeking protection. She had spent years building her reputation as a pious, long-suffering wife, and now she used that image to justify behavior that would have been considered treasonous if performed by anyone else. Her brother Charles supported her claims, partly out of family loyalty but also because weakening England served French interests. Isabella's alliance with Roger Mortimer, one of Edward's exiled enemies, transformed her from a wronged wife into a genuine political threat. But even this relationship was carefully managed to serve her manipulation strategy. She presented Mortimer as her protector and military advisor rather than her lover, maintaining the fiction that she was motivated by duty to England rather than personal ambition or passion. The invasion of England that Isabella and Mortimer launched in 1326 was brilliantly designed to maximize psychological impact while minimizing actual military resistance. Rather than landing with a massive foreign army that would have triggered nationalistic opposition, they arrived with a small force of English exiles and mercenaries, presenting themselves as liberators rather than conquerors. Isabella's propaganda campaign was remarkably sophisticated for its time. She distributed letters throughout England, explaining her actions, emphasizing her role as a mother protecting her son's inheritance and a wife driven to desperate measures by an unnatural husband. She portrayed Edward and Despenser as threats to English independence who had sold the kingdom to foreign interests, inverting the traditional accusation that would have been made against a foreign-born queen leading a rebellion. The psychological effect of Isabella's campaign was devastating for Edward's supporters. Nobles who had previously been loyal to the crown found themselves facing a choice between a foreign-influenced king and a queen claiming to defend English interests. The fact that Isabella had the heir to the throne with her made resistance seem not just futile, but treasonous to the future king. Margaret of Anjou, Queen of England during the Wars of the Roses, demonstrated similar manipulation techniques in her efforts to preserve her husband Henry VI's throne and secure her son's inheritance. Margaret's situation was even more challenging than Isabella's, because Henry VI suffered from periods of mental illness that made him completely unfit to rule, forcing her to exercise royal power while maintaining the fiction that her husband remained in control. Margaret's strategy involved creating a network of nobles who were personally loyal to her rather than to the abstract concept of royal authority. She understood that medieval loyalty was fundamentally personal. Men followed individual leaders rather than institutions, and she worked systematically to make herself the focus of that loyalty while her husband was incapacitated. Her manipulation of Henry's mental illness was particularly skillful. Rather than concealing his condition, which would have been impossible, she framed it as a temporary affliction that required patient care and protection. She positioned herself as the devoted wife whose only concern was nursing her husband back to health while protecting the kingdom from those who would take advantage of his weakness. Margaret's control over access to the king gave her enormous power that she wielded with careful precision. Nobles who wanted royal favors, pardons, or appointments had to work through her, but she granted these requests in Henry's name, making it appear that the king remained actively involved in governance. This allowed her to build a party of supporters who felt they owed their positions to royal favor rather than to her personal influence. The techniques these queens developed for manipulating male psychology were remarkably consistent across different courts and time periods. They understood that medieval men needed to feel that they were strong, honorable, and in control, so successful female manipulators crafted their strategies to reinforce rather than threaten masculine self-image. They made men feel powerful while actually controlling their decisions, heroic while actually serving female interests, and independent while actually following carefully laid plans. The sophisticated manipulation techniques developed by medieval women represent one of the most remarkable achievements in the history of psychological warfare. Operating within a system designed to exclude them from formal power, these women created methods of influence that were so effective they could control kings, reshape kingdoms, and alter the course of European history. Understanding their techniques reveals not just historical curiosities, but timeless insights into human psychology and the nature of power itself. The foundation of medieval female manipulation was the masterful exploitation of male ego and insecurity. Medieval masculinity was defined by concepts of honor, strength, and authority that were constantly under threat in the violent, competitive world of feudal politics. Successful female manipulators understood that men's greatest fear was not physical danger but public humiliation or the appearance of weakness, and they crafted their strategies to exploit these psychological vulnerabilities. The technique of ego reinforcement was perhaps the most fundamental tool in the medieval female manipulator's arsenal. Rather than directly challenging male authority, which would have triggered defensive reactions, these women made men feel more powerful and important while subtly guiding their decisions. They perfected the art of asking questions that led men toward predetermined conclusions while making them believe they had reached these conclusions through their own superior wisdom. Eleanor of Aquitaine's conversations with her husbands provide perfect examples of this technique in action. When she wanted Louis VII to join the Second Crusade, she didn't argue for the campaign's military or political benefits. Instead, she expressed admiration for other kings who had taken the cross, worried aloud about whether they were doing enough to serve God, and praised Louis's spiritual sensitivity. By the time she finished, Louis was convinced that crusading was his own brilliant idea that would demonstrate his superiority over rival rulers. The manipulation of religious sentiment was another crucial technique that medieval women used to control male behavior. In an age when Christianity provided the moral framework for all political action, the ability to present personal desires as religious duties gave women enormous leverage over men who were genuinely devout. Matilda of Tuscany's success in controlling both Pope Gregory VII and Emperor Henry IV depended largely on her ability to frame her political goals as spiritual necessities. This religious manipulation often involved what modern psychologists would recognize as emotional blackmail, disguised as moral concern. Women would express fears about the spiritual consequences of certain actions, worry about their husbands' souls, or suggest that divine displeasure might explain various misfortunes. Men who might have dismissed purely political arguments found themselves unable to resist appeals that seemed to come from feminine piety and spiritual wisdom. Sexual manipulation, while more dangerous, was also a powerful tool when used skillfully. Medieval women understood that male sexual desire could be channeled into political compliance through careful management of availability and attention. This didn't necessarily involve overt sexuality. Often it was more about creating emotional intimacy that made men feel special and understood while making them more susceptible to influence. Isabella of France's relationship with Roger Mortimer demonstrates how sexual alliances could be transformed into political partnerships. While their romantic involvement was genuine, Isabella ensured that Mortimer's emotional attachment to her reinforced rather than conflicted with her political objectives. She made him feel like her protector and champion while using his military skills to achieve her own goals of deposing Edward II and controlling England through her son. The technique of triangulation involved playing different men against each other while positioning oneself as the crucial mediator between them. This strategy required extraordinary skill because it involved maintaining relationships with multiple parties who had conflicting interests while ensuring that none of them realized they were being manipulated. Successful practitioners could escalate or diffuse conflicts as needed while always remaining indispensable to all parties involved. Matilda of Tuscany's management of the relationship between Pope Gregory VII and Emperor Henry IV represents the pinnacle of triangulation strategy. She maintained influence over both men by ensuring that each needed her support to achieve his goals, while preventing either from becoming powerful enough to eliminate her usefulness. The Canossa incident was brilliant, precisely because it weakened both Gregory and Henry while strengthening Matilda's position as the indispensable broker between secular and religious authority. Long-term relationship cultivation was perhaps the most sophisticated technique employed by medieval female manipulators. Rather than seeking immediate gains that might expose their methods, the most successful practitioners spent years or even decades building networks of loyalty, obligation, and emotional attachment that could be activated when needed. This approach required patience, consistency, and an almost supernatural ability to remember and track complex webs of personal relationships. Eleanor of Aquitaine's cultivation of her sons demonstrates this long-term approach perfectly. She didn't simply turn them against their father impulsively. She spent years shaping their understanding of royal authority, their father's failings, and their own destinies as future rulers. By the time they rebelled against Henry II, they believed they were acting on their own judgment rather than following their mother's carefully laid plans. The manipulation of information and communication was another crucial skill that medieval women developed to extraordinary levels. In an age when news traveled slowly and written communication was limited, the ability to control what information reached which people at what times provided enormous strategic advantages. Successful female manipulators became the centers of communication networks that allowed them to shape perceptions and influence decisions across vast distances. This information control often involved what modern intelligence agencies would recognize as classic disinformation techniques. Women would spread carefully crafted rumors that advanced their interests, share selective truths that painted their enemies in negative lights, and withhold crucial information until releasing it would have maximum impact. They understood that in medieval society, reputation and perception were often more important than objective facts. The psychological isolation of targets was another sophisticated technique that medieval women used to increase their influence over important men. By gradually separating men from alternative sources of advice and emotional support, manipulators could make themselves indispensable while reducing their target's ability to recognize what was happening to them. This isolation was often accomplished so gradually that the victims never realized they were being cut off from independent perspectives. The long-term consequences of these manipulation techniques were profound and lasting. The women who mastered these methods didn't just achieve their immediate goals, they fundamentally altered the balance of power between men and women in medieval society. They demonstrated that female intelligence could overcome male physical advantages and legal privileges, establishing precedents that would influence gender dynamics for centuries to come. However, the success of these techniques also came with significant costs. The constant need for manipulation and deception took enormous psychological tolls on the women who employed them. They could never relax, never trust completely, never enjoy genuine relationships without calculating their political implications. Many of the most successful female manipulators of the medieval period ended their lives isolated, paranoid, and emotionally exhausted from decades of psychological warfare. The techniques these women developed also contributed to broader patterns of political instability and social conflict. Their success in manipulating male rulers often led to wars, rebellions, and dynastic struggles that caused enormous suffering for ordinary people. The Wars of the Roses, the investiture controversy, and numerous other medieval conflicts were partially the result of successful female manipulation campaigns that achieved their immediate objectives while creating long-term chaos. The medieval women who mastered the art of political manipulation achieved something that would have been unthinkable in any other historical context. They wielded real power in a system designed to exclude them completely. Through psychological sophistication, strategic patience, and ruthless pragmatism, they transformed the very weaknesses that society imposed on them into weapons of extraordinary effectiveness. Their techniques reveal timeless truths about human psychology and the nature of influence that remain relevant today. The manipulation of ego, The exploitation of insecurity, the careful management of information, and the patient cultivation of emotional dependence are strategies that continue to be used by politicians, business leaders, and anyone seeking to influence others without formal authority. Perhaps most remarkably, these women achieved their success while maintaining the appearance of conforming to medieval gender expectations. They presented themselves as devoted wives, loving mothers, and pious Christians while secretly orchestrating some of the most dramatic political events of their age. Their ability to hide revolutionary behavior behind traditional facades demonstrates a level of strategic thinking that rivals anything produced by the great military or political theorists of later periods. The legacy of these medieval puppet masters extends far beyond their individual achievements. They established precedents for female political involvement that would influence European history for centuries, proving that women could compete successfully with men in the most demanding arenas of power and strategy. They also developed techniques of psychological manipulation that would be studied and employed by future generations of political operatives, regardless of gender. Their stories serve as both inspiration and warning. Inspiration for anyone seeking to overcome systematic disadvantages through intelligence and determination, but warning about the costs of living a life based on manipulation and deception. They achieved extraordinary success, but at the price of genuine human connection and emotional peace. These women didn't just survive in a man's world, they conquered it, one carefully calculated move at a time. Their invisible empire of influence shaped European civilization in ways that are still being discovered by historians today.